Hi. Actually, you're going to hear all day about interesting stuff going on across different projects at the OpenSSF. I thought it would be helpful just for those of you who, look, you've self-selected by coming to this event to today in competition with lots of other exciting things happening here in the convention center. So I appreciate that. Thank you for choosing us. I thought it might be helpful for some of you to hear a little bit of the backstory of where we came from and kind of get like a breadth first kind of overview of what we're doing, what the philosophy is, how we're working, to give you some context for some of the deep dives that you'll see later today. So thought that would be helpful. And why is this not completely sharing? Sorry, that's so annoying. Present a slideshow. That's what I wanted. Okay. So with that one, I just dig in. So the OpenSSF is a global initiative securing investment, resources, and expertise to improve the security of open source software in the software supply chain. It's kind of recognizing the role, the unique role that open source software plays today across the entirety of the software landscape. It's kind of impossible to escape open source code at this point, not that anyone would want to, which means that bugs that are inside of open source code exhibit themselves in lots of very pernicious ways. You'll hear Log4j and kind of the Log4Shell breach perhaps as an example of kind of many of these things, but just as one example, that vulnerability turned up in everything from critical infrastructure like water and management plants to badges to get into rooms for when you're badging with an RFID to get in, to Apple's iTunes website, right? Small bugs can have these pernicious effects, and so it's and secondly, how we write open source code, the mechanisms, the social interactions, the tools often came about at times of very high trust. When the internet was a lot smaller, when the software world was a lot smaller, frankly, and we built lots of social structures for understanding how do we trust the software that we consume and build a relationship with the people whose software we use that today simply doesn't scale. So we need to be thinking about tools and updated processes that handle the volume of code that we're dealing with today, and that's what the Open Source Security Foundation is all about. And that means, in some cases, writing code. So that's definitely in the wheelhouse of the Linux Foundation. We're home for lots and lots of software projects that write an awful lot of code. It also means we are home for specifications work. You'll hear a bit today about SLSA, which is specifications for attestations in a software supply chain. But increasingly, there's a call for other kind of common formats and common specs for things in the software space. And you'll hear lots of talk about some of the educational resources that we have put together at the OpenSSF as well, the combination of which we think and we hope, we firmly believe, will lead to a more secure, not just open source landscape, but a more secure world. And really helping open source developers and communities take a risk-weighted view of the software they consume and the ways that they produce software is the kind of impact that we'd like to have. It's perhaps kind of trite to mention this at this point, but the data is pretty overwhelming that an average software stack inside of a car, a phone, a web service, that 90% of the code behind that is pre-existing open source code. And of course, it's the 10% that everyone is paid to build and gets compensated for and like builds tremendous value out there and is cool. But we're standing on the shoulders of giants in so many ways, each other's shoulders, really, as we build and deploy code. And yet, so much of that code ships with known vulnerabilities, ships with stuff that perhaps many layers down is vulnerable, and end users don't really recognize this or realize this. And we ourselves in the open source space, kind of ignore that fact at our own risk. So in trying to address these kinds of issues, there's 6 different kind of ways of slicing this. We think it's important to prioritize open source projects out there. All of you are familiar with that XKCD comic, not 927, which is a 1030 something. Somebody will quote the verse from it, which shows here's the small little component that if that fails, the whole rest of the internet comes tumbling down. Well, how do we find that? How do we understand criticality, not just in terms terms of painting a graph of which projects depend upon which, but also weighting that by usage out there. How do we think about criticality based on the kinds of industries that software is being deployed in? So finding that and trying to figure out if we were going to go and try to upgrade security of specific projects, what are the most important 50 or 100 or 10,000 to start with is one big component of what we do. Automation through better tooling is critical as well. Software developers, if you tell them, we need you to be more secure in how you write code, here's a checklist, they'll kind of yawn or push back. If you say, here are tools that you have to use, that add a lot of extra burden, or you must use these scanning tools and get a clean report out of it, that can come across as an imposition. That can come across as make work. But the more that you can automate through the build tools, through development tools, and particularly through the way that software gets distributed or the way that developers decide which components to pick up, the more that you can get better security practices and principles baked into those tools, the easier it is for developers to adopt those and for them to be a zero lift for people writing code. And we think that's incredibly important. As mentioned, we believe educating developers on best practices, educating them on how to build better, more secure code is critical. You'll hear a lot more about that today, including from Krob and from Marta and others who will speak this afternoon on this. But it's amazing how little formal training there is in avoiding the kinds of common mistakes that lead to so many of the CVEs out there. And we think there's actually some really easy wins in that space. We think it's important as well to resource the fixes for vulnerabilities in open source. It's not enough to scream at the cloud and say, all your stuff is broken. It's not even enough to go and find these vulnerabilities or to tell people that looks like a risky thing. You have to step in with resources to provide fixes for that. And ideally, you create an ecosystem where the downstream users of code have some sort of connection to the upstream that either by direct contribution of fixes or providing resources to fix things upstream, they're able to get that work done and be additive to the development efforts, because it's so important to recognize maintainers on open source projects, developers tend to be overworked, they tend to be burdened, there tends to be a lot of free ridership in open source, which we've kind of accepted as the way things are today. The answer to that isn't by hectoring them and telling them write more secure code, it's by showing up with help. And so that's a critical part of what we do. We think it's important to identify new kinds of security threats as well. Certainly the rise of attacks on the software supply chain cause us to have to care about things like signing artifacts throughout the software supply chain, not just at the very end where we tend to be pretty good at that. But let's identify new kinds of threats that affect things further upstream and think about, are there systematic ways to mitigate those or to eliminate security vulnerability, classes of security vulnerabilities at once. And then finally, again, standardize. Look for ways to standardize the way that these supply chains form when they're forming across ecosystems, when they're forming across language ecosystems, right? Forming across industries, of course. How do we look for and build tools to help standardize a lot of these practices so that, again, it becomes a default part of writing open source code is it's written more securely. And so we have quite a few working groups across the OpenSSF that map to these different modes of engagement, these different slices of what we do. And this is a hierarchy. The predominant kind of part of that hierarchy is something called a working group. Within that working group, there can be a long list of projects and other kinds of technical initiatives that go and tackle different things. Some of those are still works in progress. Others have been creating output for even longer than I've been involved with the project, for more than the last year. And they run the gamut from best practices to vulnerability disclosures, understanding how folks build, how do we discover new vulnerabilities and how do we coordinate the release of those, how do we look at the standards in the vulnerability disclosure space, that sort of thing, to identifying security threats, as I mentioned, where there's a lot of investment in quantitatively trying to understand where those most critical projects might be. as well to security tooling, as I mentioned, SALSA and the like. I'm sorry, not SALSA. Tools like the OSS Fuzz tooling for fuzz testing of software applications, right? To securing software repositories, which is still a pretty young working group that pulls together many of the people behind NPM and PyPI, Rust crates, and some of these other, essentially the app stores of the open source landscape, and asks, are there some common techniques such as mandating second factor auth, to other ways of highlighting more secure options in the collections of tools or collections of packages you distribute, other ways that those repositories could work together to uplift open source as a whole, to looking at software supply chain integrity. There's a working group focused on that, which actually started life looking at identity and then kind of pivoted to saying, well, maybe the focus should be on things like SALSA for describing supply chain levels for software artifacts, which is what SALSA stands for. Again, levels of confidence and attestations in the way that software is built as it flows through the chain. Two final working groups, one on securing critical projects. This is where some of the work has gone into things like the criticality score, the scorecards work, and All-Star, to package analysis tools, to try to say, is this package, the way that they built it, was that done securely? And then finally, a working group that is just launched, in fact, we'll talk more about it today, called the End Users Working Group, focusing on, on the security needs and perspectives of the organizations that are major consumers of open source code and have started to feedback upstream, but aren't themselves cloud providers or platform providers or tools providers, right? They have a unique set of needs, and organizing to figure out how to meet those is an important thing. All these working groups roll up to a technical advisory council. And I'll show you a picture of who's on that in just a bit, but this is really the heart of the technical oversight in the organization. It's an advisory council because they try to have a light touch on the projects, but at the end of the day, it's really what makes sure that there's harmony between the efforts of the different working groups. And one thing I should throw out, unlike certain other communities that have a let 1,000 flowers bloom point of view in terms of let's be the home for all things cloud or all things enterprise blockchain, one of the principles at OpenSSF is let's try to come up with one or a small number of answers to the major problems that are out there and really try to focus resources and focus our efforts, which are not without limit, right, onto the best possible solutions to a given set of problems. Not that we can't experiment, not that we can't look at disruptive innovations in some ways, but let's really try to hone what we're doing out there into the best possible set for end users. And that's where the TAC plays an essential role in kind of overseeing this. But there are some other parts of this chart as well. There's a couple of funds that we've created to the side to focus on a couple of specific areas. One to help resource SigStore, which is the package signing service. Another for a project called Alpha Omega, which you'll hear a lot about again today. And one to help support the efforts of the GNU toolchain community in their build infrastructure and help secure that. And then finally, there is the more kind of bookkeeping and resourcing and kind of financing side of the organization, which is led by our premier members and a governing board with some committees under that to try to just help support the efforts of the technical community, make sure there's kind of a logical flow to it, and it's responsive to the needs of the whole industry. So a couple of things that you'll be hearing more about today, and in some cases I won't spill the beans. I'll let Michael Scavetta tell you more about what's going on in Alpha Omega. But you'll be hearing today more about the new end users working group, as I mentioned. You'll hear about these two new concise guides for developing more secure software and for evaluating open source software from a security point of view. The attempt to be the message being, here's a simple way to understand how to do both of those. To a coordinated vulnerability disclosure guide for finders, to discussions about the support that we're starting to show for further development in the SBOM world through funding some libraries for SPDX. And then some other things that have been announced recently have been a publication of a document called Best Practices for the NPM ecosystem, or for the NPM supply chain. And then finally, some updates to the scorecard security badges. This is really just meant to give a sense of breadth, right? How many different software ecosystems we're touching, how many different communities, how many different folks are involved in the OpenSSF. It's kind of a circus, and I say that lovingly. It's, because there's so much going on in these different rings of orbit, but that also means there's a whole lot of need for other folks to help us build this, and other organizations to get involved, and a lot of opportunities to do that and really have an impact. Here is the Technical Advisory Board Technical Advisory Council. I should have, mistitled this. Dan Loring, Josh Bressers, Luke Hines, Krobe, who a very familiar face, Bob Calloway, who's here in the audience, Ava, I think, might be here, and Abhishek Arya. All of these are people who care deeply about the mission of the OpenSSF, and again, help harmonize all the work going on and make sure that the investments of time, of energy, of attention, and in some cases of financial resources are all appropriately applied. And of course, a big thank you to the organizations that have selected to help us with this mission as premier members, as organizations who say this is a major part of their involvement in open source software, and they really wanted to help make sure that this gets off in the best possible direction. Thank you to all of those and all of you in the room who are a part of these organizations for your support, as well as a large number of other organizations helping as general members and as associate members. These are partners who we work with to just get the word out more widely and look to other communities to be partnered with. And that is the big picture for the OpenSSF. And throughout the day, again, you'll hear more about deep dives into many of the different working groups and projects, and also hope that you'll have really take advantage today of a chance to ask questions, engage with people here. In fact, Krobe, should we talk about the unconference part coming up too?
We can do that again, yes.
Yeah, okay. Just as a reminder, because I think you did mention this in your talk, we've got a couple of boards up here in front. During the break, we really welcome folks to add a mention of the kinds of topics you'd like to talk about, perhaps even things you want to hear more about. And then towards the end of that break, you'll be able to vote on the ones you like, and then the top 4 or 5 of those will break out into subgroups around this room and maybe in the lobby to talk about right before lunch. And it'll be really great to hear from all of you. What do you want to know about the OpenSSF and what we're doing? And with that, I will hand the baton back to Krobe. Thank you so much.